I didn't sell the 3 organic farms in Oregon. Instead, I turned them into something my grandfather would have respected. I created the Olivia Henderson Foundation, a sanctuary for veterans navigating the dangerous terrain of financial abuse. We provide forensic accounting, legal support, and advocacy for service members whose families mistook their sacrifice for a blank check. Grandpa had been right. Those properties weren't trophies, they were responsibilities. I hired management teams who valued transparency and fair wages over quick profits. The income now flows steady and honest, building lives instead of funding gambling debts or luxury vacations. That was real justice. Not the foreclosure of my parents' house, but the creation of a legacy that actually meant something. Real revenge isn't about how much you can burn down, it's about how much you can grow from the ashes of betrayal. While David and Emily were busy performing Family for an audience that finally saw through the illusion, I was busy building something for the invisible. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a daughter who needed managing and became a woman who defined her own worth. I returned their lessons of conditional love, neatly wrapped in a foreclosure notice, and stepped into a future they could no longer touch. A few months later, I went back to that hill in Oregon. I stood beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the property and watched the sun lean toward evening. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt full. I took a deep breath of mountain air and realized something for the first time in my life. I wasn't waiting for a signature. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. "Grandpa," I whispered, "I did okay. I didn't just protect the assets, I protected the person you saw when nobody else was looking. This story is proof that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's preparation. And when the moment comes, it delivers absolute justice." I still remember the desert heat, the crushing weight of my gear, and the steady thump of mortars somewhere in the distance. Every time my military pay hit my account, I repeated the same ritual of self-sabotage. I transferred 70% of it straight back to this house. I told myself I was protecting our heritage. I believed I was guarding the 3 organic farms my grandfather had built with his own hands. My father would call me on secure lines, his voice loaded with carefully crafted panic. He'd tell me interest rates were climbing, suppliers were threatening, and the family business was one missed payment away from collapse. I treated those calls like mission briefings. I believed love was a contract, and I was proud to be the one keeping it alive. I can still feel sand grinding between my teeth when I think about those months. I'd sit in the back of a transport, sweating through my uniform, checking my banking app just to confirm the wire transfer went through. It gave me purpose. It made me feel necessary. I thought I was the foundation holding the Henderson family together. I was the one standing in the line of fire. In my mind, they were the ones I was protecting, but while I was eating sand and counting rations, my brother Tyler was upgrading his lifestyle. I look at him now, sitting comfortably in that armchair, scrolling on a phone that costs more than my first month of hazard pay. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another powerful journey of reclaiming identity, dignity, and control. The house, once heavy with lemon cleaner and forced cheer, now smelled like the end of a long, coordinated lie. The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes took in the locked guest room door, the missing phone from the charger, the way Emily hovered too close, like a warden guarding an inmate. "Miss Henderson," she said, looking directly at me, "we received your recordings and documentation from Councillor Hayes. Are you being held here against your will?" I stood. The movement was smooth, controlled. I held out my hand. David looked at the officers, then at the floor, and slowly placed my car keys into my palm. "I was," I said steadily, "but the situation has changed." Emily collapsed into the armchair, her face blotchy, distorted by tears that finally looked real. Not from remorse, but from fear. "Olivia, please," she sobbed, reaching for me. "We're your parents. You can't do this to your own blood. We were only thinking about this family's future. I looked at her. Then at the mahogany table, the crystal glasses, the illusion of power. For years, they'd played the role of the successful, elite Henderson family while operating from an empty wallet. They rented status using my hazard pay and my grandfather's silence. They mistook my bank account for their own character. Without my money bridging the gap between their ambition and reality, they weren't powerful. They were bankrupt. Morally, financially, completely. "You're not protecting a family," I said, turning to my father. "You're managing a failing business, and I've decided to pull my investment." I removed a single sheet of paper from my bag and placed it on the table. It wasn't a medical waiver. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. "Councillor Hayes didn't just find your forged signature," I continued. "He found the second mortgage you took out 18 months ago. Since you haven't made a payment in 90 days, the bank has already begun foreclosure proceedings." I met David's eyes one last time. "I didn't just secure the trust," I said. "I bought the note. The farms. I used a holding company to buy the mortgage note directly from the bank." That made one thing very clear. "I'm not just your daughter anymore," I said evenly. "I'm your lender." David's mouth opened, then closed again. No words came out. His eyes were locked on the legal header at the top of the document, like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. "I now own this property," I continued, my voice as cold and steady as a winter deployment. "You have 7 days to sign this voluntary vacate agreement and leave." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "If you comply," I said, "I'll waive the $450,000 you stole, and I won't pursue criminal charges for forgery. But if you're still here on day 8, the sheriff will carry out a formal eviction, and I'll hand every piece of evidence over to the district attorney." Tyler started to mutter something about legal rights, but one glance from the officers shut him down. They'd already seen the bank records. They'd already heard the recordings of them planning to lock me away. There was no version of me left that they could control. I walked toward the front door, my boots clicking against the hardwood floor I had paid to refinish 3 years earlier. I didn't turn around. I didn't listen to the excuses or the pleading. I didn't need their permission to leave. I had already taken the door with me. I moved into the Manhattan mansion quietly. No announcements, no social media posts. Just the solid, final sound of a key turning in a lock that belonged to me alone. That first night, I slept on a mattress on the floor with the windows wide open, listening to the city roar beneath me. It felt like dropping a heavy rucksack I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying, 5 years of war and a lifetime of family expectations. The weight was gone. What replaced it was a strange, intoxicating mix of loneliness and absolute relief. Emily's hand twitched as I shifted away from her touch. The air didn't just change, it hardened. David frowned, his hand instinctively brushing the keys in his pocket. "Olivia, honey, you're getting worked up again," he started, his voice low and patronizing. I didn't let him finish. "You were brought here under false pretenses," I said, my voice cutting through the room like cold steel. "There is no medical emergency, there is no consent, and you have 0 authority here." I reached beneath a throw pillow and pulled out my iPad, the one I'd been using under the covers at 3 in the morning. I didn't wait for David to shout or for Tyler to crack a joke. I tapped a link. The screen filled with the calm, professional face of Councillor Hayes. David's expression collapsed from confusion into fear. "Councillor," I said, locking eyes with my father, "are the assets secure?" Hayes didn't smile. He looked like a man who took real satisfaction in a plan executed cleanly and without leaks. "Airtight, Olivia," Hayes said, his voice filling the room through the iPad speakers. "The 3 organic farms here in Oregon and the Manhattan mansion have all been placed into an irrevocable trust. You are the sole beneficiary. Your parents, your brother, and your sister have no legal standing to access, view, or even inquire about those properties." He didn't pause. Any attempt to pursue guardianship will trigger an immediate injunction. Emily let out a tight, strangled sound. "Olivia, how could you?" she whispered. "We were only trying to protect you." I didn't look at her. My eyes stayed locked on David, who was staring at the iPad like it might explode in his hands. "This wasn't protection," I said calmly. Flat. Precise. "It was a hostile takeover. And you forgot one thing about tactical analysts. We always study the paper trail before we engage." I leaned forward slightly. "I didn't just secure the farms. I audited my own life." On the screen, Hayes cleared his throat, his expression turning darker. "There is a secondary issue, Olivia. During a forensic review of your military savings account, we identified a pattern of irregular withdrawals over the last 18 months. David didn't move. "It appears," Hayes continued, "that David Henderson forged your signature to withdraw $450,000. The room froze. "Our records show those funds were wired to settle high-interest personal loans and gambling debts under the name of Tyler Henderson." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was final. David's face drained of color, turning a dull, unhealthy gray. Tyler's foot, always bouncing, always restless, went still. The smug look he'd been wearing didn't fade. It cracked. It shattered. I rubbed my eyes, not because I felt regret, but because I needed clarity. This wasn't a family conflict. This was a criminal discovery. David hadn't just overdrafted my compassion. He'd stolen the literal cost of my survival. $450,000 of hazard pay burned on Tyler's bad bets. "That's a felony, David," I said, my voice as emotionless as a dial tone. "Forging the signature of an active duty service member to steal federal funds is a serious crime." I held his stare. "You weren't worried about my mental health. You were terrified I'd check the balance and realize you'd emptied the vault." I leaned back, and for the first time, the couch didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a command chair. I wasn't the daughter they needed to manage. I was the creditor they could never repay. This wasn't revenge. This was accounting, and the interest was about to crush them. The doorbell rang for the third time that morning. Not a doctor, not an accomplice. It was the sound of the perimeter closing. David tried to stand, still gripping my car keys, but his legs failed him. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by a woman in a sharp grey suit from Adult Protective Services. I was standing on my parents' front porch in Oregon, just staring at the door. The air smelled like wet pine needles mixed with funeral lilies, and that scent clung stubbornly to my black uniform. In my hands, I held a thick envelope from my grandfather's lawyer. Inside it were deeds, 3 organic farms and a mansion in Manhattan. I was seconds away from walking inside and telling them everything. Then I heard my mother's voice through the door. She wasn't grieving. She was planning. "The doctor will be here tomorrow," my father David said quietly. "With her military record," my mother replied, calm and precise. "1 post-traumatic stress diagnosis is all we need to get guardianship. After that, those assets belong to us." Have you ever felt invisible inside your own family? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. The anger didn't explode inside me the way you'd expect. It didn't burn, it sharpened, it went cold and focused. After 5 years working as a tactical analyst, I'd learned something important. The loudest person in the room is usually the one already losing. So I didn't burst through the door. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them. Instead, I slipped my hand into my pocket, tapped the voice recorder on my phone, and took a slow, controlled breath. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to become the version of myself they expected to see, a worn-down soldier, crushed by grief and exhaustion. I needed them to believe their plan was already working. I opened the door and let my shoulders slump. "I'm home," I said quietly, thinning my voice on purpose. My mother, Emily, rushed toward me with her arms wide open. It looked like a hug, but it felt more like a trap snapping shut. "Oh, honey, you look so pale," she said. "You must be exhausted." Her concern sounded sweet, but now I recognized it for what it was. It was the smile of a predator. I let her lead me to the couch. I sat exactly where she told me to sit. I drank the water she handed me. I played my role perfectly, the fragile porcelain doll they were already planning to break. Inside my head, though, the math had already started. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. From every deployment, I sent home 70% of my paycheck. I honestly believed I was protecting our legacy. Over and over again, I poured my kindness into a glass they never stopped breaking. I was done being their safety net. This house wasn't a home. It was a prison without bars. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness, a symptom of a mind unraveling under stress. Meanwhile, they were already whispering about the assets sitting in my bag, counting them like numbers on a spreadsheet while I sat barely 2 feet away. People always ask why victims stay quiet, why they don't fight back the moment betrayal shows its face. What they don't understand is the invisible chain. When you grow up being told you're the problem, the difficult one, you learn to wait. My silence wasn't surrender, it was reconnaissance. I was scanning the room, tracking exits, and identifying weak points. In special operations, we call that shaping the battlefield. You let the other side believe they're winning, right up until the ground disappears beneath them. Days passed in silence, but their words never left my head. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and old coffee, the familiar scent of a house that had spent my entire life using me as currency. For 5 years, I wasn't a son. I was a high-yield asset on their private ledger. The light caught the edge of my brother's designer watch, flashing off something that cost him 3 months of my life in a combat zone. Earlier, he'd been bragging about his new truck, a $60,000 monster that I had basically paid for with money I thought was keeping the farm alive. My sister Kayla wasn't any better. She was already scrolling through flight prices to New York, leaning close to our mother and whispering about which Manhattan boutique she wanted to visit first. Once that mansion was locked in, they didn't see sacrifice anymore. All they saw were numbers. To them, my compassion had been a luxury line item, one they'd been overdrafting for years. When they looked at my deployments, they didn't see service or duty. They saw a dependable revenue stream. My family wasn't a support system. It was a subscription service, and I was the only one paying the bill. The peeling paint on the porch wasn't proof of hard times. It was evidence of something worse, moral decay. They had the resources, my resources, but they chose instant gratification instead. Expensive vacations, designer clothes, quick thrills. All of it mattered more to them than maintaining the legacy they loved to talk about. That was the moment it finally clicked. I wasn't protecting a home, I was financing a robbery. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp and clinical, like a starting pistol. This was it, their final move. David opened the door, wearing the practiced seriousness of a man presiding over a funeral. He greeted Dr. Collins with a firm, professional handshake. Collins didn't look like a healer. He looked like a board member at a mid-level pharmaceutical company, tailored jacket, polished shoes, and eyes that carried a kind of warmth that had clearly been purchased. He smiled at me. It was narrow, condescending, the kind of smile people use on children or injured animals. "You must be Olivia," he said gently, as he sat across from me and opened a leather portfolio. "Your family has expressed serious concerns about how you're adjusting to civilian life." I nodded slowly and let my eyes drift past him, focusing on nothing. I let my hands shake, just enough to be noticeable, not enough to look rehearsed. I'm just tired," I whispered. Emily sat down beside me, her hand settling heavily on my shoulder. It wasn't comforting. It was possessive. "Doctor, she's been so jumpy," my mother said. She sits in the dark for hours. We're terrified she might hurt herself or make a bad decision with the legacy her grandfather left. Collins scribbled something in his file. Confusion, disorientation, difficulty handling complex responsibilities, he said calmly. These are common signs of severe combat-related trauma. It may be wise to consider temporary solutions, extra support, oversight, someone to manage things while you recover. I lifted my head slightly, letting my eyes go unfocused. Like guardianship? I asked quietly. The temperature in the room dropped. Emily laughed, light and nervous, the sound never reaching her eyes. Oh, sweetheart, don't use such scary words. We're just talking about a little help. But the help began immediately. Olivia, honey, Emily said, reaching for my bag. I'll hold on to your phone. You don't need constant notifications right now. And I've got the car keys, David added smoothly. We don't want you driving in this condition. It's for your safety. I watched Emily's hand close around my phone. I watched David slip my keys into his pocket. Piece by piece, they were cutting me off from the outside world, and doing it with smiles. This is how normalized cruelty works. It doesn't always come with yelling or violence. Sometimes it wears the mask of concern. It's the slow erosion of your boundaries until you start believing your independence is a problem. They had turned my service, my sacrifice, and my identity into weapons. For years they told themselves this was for my own good, but it never was. This was greed. They weren't protecting me. They were liquidating me. They had reduced a daughter to a portfolio, something to manage, trade, and cash out. I leaned back, letting the fragile slump fall away from my shoulders. My posture straightened, not just confident but precise, controlled, military. Dr. Collins stopped writing mid-sentence.